It's my pleasure to welcome you to the William James Lecture for 2007. This annual event is a very happy occasion and one in which we have had a number of distinguished speakers in the past, as we do today. In 1968, the John Lindsley Fund gave the sum of $50,000 to establish at Harvard Divinity School a fund to endow the William James Lectures on Religious Experience for the purpose of having an outstanding scholar or scholars lecture annually on some aspect of this subject. The fund was established by Thayer Lindsley, son of John, who had a long-standing interest in William James as a teacher as well as in his religious ideas. James had earned a medical degree from Harvard, as most of you probably know, and of course taught here as well for many years. But it seemed appropriate to not only did he taught here, he even had an honorary doctorate awarded to him from Harvard, so he actually had a doctoral degree from Harvard, not just a medical degree. But he taught at the medical school, and he was subsequently given this honorary doctorate to recognize his work there as a leading scholar. And of course, by that time, he had become a leading international scholar. And so it seemed appropriate to the trustees of the John Lindsley Fund to establish these lectures in honor of James here at HDS rather than at the medical school, largely because of James's interest in religion and, of course, because of his, I think you could call, epochal book. And I think looking back at it today, we may not see it in quite those same terms. Our introductory courses for doctoral students, the seminars, or even for undergraduates, the sophomore seminars, often have people reading the varieties of religious experience. And I think given all of the scholarship since that has in fact been inspired by or either in opposition to or in train with the varieties, makes people not realize quite what a band-breaking book it was at the time that it appeared. It was based in part on a questionnaire, as you may know, about religious practices, one that was circulated throughout the Harvard community by one of James's students. His aim in this book was, as it turned out, was not to defend religion by scientific proof, but instead to stake out his own position as a piecemeal supernaturalist, as he called himself in his Genuine Reality. One who, as he said, admits miracles and providential leadings and finds no intellectual difficulty in mixing the ideal and real worlds together, end quote, to locate where the ideal region, as he called it, interacted with the real world's details. That is, of course, to cause experiences, prayer, epiphany, visions, seizures that involve religious visions, whatever may happen, that generate faith in the end by radical experience. I think this year's lecture, at least to look at the title, stands James's idea perhaps on its head, and I think we all can look forward to it with a great deal of anticipation. Because, of course, I think here we're probably going to see someone looking at how misguided applications of faith can generate James's real-world details that are antithetical in many cases to religion and to religious faith. Like the Ingersoll lecture last fall, this event speaks to the theme of HDS's year-long consideration, or at least focus. We're always considering this, but our year-long focus on issues of diversity and pluralism in race, in class, and in religion. This year's lecturer, Ghassan Hage, whom we've been privileged to have with us this term, is going to be introduced by our colleague and his, Michael Jackson, our distinguished professor of world religions. Michael, and anthropology, I should say. Michael.
Thank you, Bill. It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce this evening Professor Ghassan Hage, this year's presenter of the William James Lecture on Religious Experience. As most of you know, Ghassan is currently visiting associate professor at the Divinity School and a research associate at the Center for the Study of World Religions. Ghassan Hage is presently chair of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Sydney, though he will take up a new appointment at the University of Melbourne next year as, quote, future generation professor of anthropology and social theory. Ghassan's research is in the areas of migration, multiculturalism, racism, and ethno-religious identification and conflict from a comparative point of view. And he has drawn intellectual inspiration from sources as varied as Bourdieu's political sociology, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and Spinoza's ethics in groundbreaking publications that include White Nation, Fantasies of White Supremacy in a Multicultural Society, 2000, Arab Australians Today, 2002, and Against Paranoid Nationalism, 2003, a book which was awarded the prestigious 2004 New South Wales Premier's Literary Award. His current writing projects include The Diasporic Condition, the result of a 4-year period of Australian-funded research on transnational Lebanese migration. He is also finishing a work, Good Christians, Bad Muslims, a Lebanese prelude to a global configuration, which is a continuation of a long-term research on the Christian Lebanese experience of the ethno-religious conflict in Lebanon. In all Ghassan Hage's work, his concern is to capture, through situated empirical analysis, exactly what constitutes for a given people the cultural and personal wherewithal for gaining recognition, securing presence, and possessing well-being, a struggle that plays out within political orders that distribute the wherewithal of life unequally, withholding recognition and resources to some while making it abundantly available to others. Ghassan Hage's concern is never partisan, however, for he is at pains to point out that both cosmologies of the powerless and of the powerful must be addressed in any research that seeks to understand racist fantasies, social inequalities, and xenophobic behavior. There is always a sense in Ghassan's writing, whether on modalities of national and ethnic belonging, on the micropolitics of power, on the ontology of the gift, or on the struggle of minorities, migrants, and refugees for participation and recognition in the nation-state, of the deep tension in all human lives between being a who, a subject who actively participates in the making or unmaking of his or her world, and being a what, a subject who suffers and is subjected to actions by others, as well as habits and forces of circumstance that lie largely outside his or her control. Ghassan Hage draws on Spinoza's ethics to argue that being is never some fixed or intrinsic attribute, an essence that one has or does not have, for insofar as being is being in the world, tied to contexts of interactions with others within socio-political systems, it is in continual flux. And it is the analysis of this flux, this force field, in which the very definition of who is worthy of humanity is at stake. His talk this evening, entitled "This is Not a Religious Experience, Muslims in the West and the Specter of Extermination," is a variation on this theme. Please join me in offering a warm welcome to Professor Hage.
Thank you, Michael, for a very long intellectual companionship. Since I've known Michael in Sydney, I've had the opportunity to be drawn by him to Copenhagen, to various places in years we've taught together, and now in Harvard. So thanks very much for all these invitations. Thanks very much for the Dean of the Divinity School for having me as a visitor here. And I also like to thank Professor Don Swearer for having me not just teaching, but even sleeping in the center. In what I got to know, I heard from fellow anthropologists, is called God's Motel. So I feel very privileged indeed. I also feel very thankful for the opportunity to give this lecture because it allowed me, really, to be quite honest, to read William James's varieties of religious experience. My acquaintance with James has been an acquaintance with pragmatism on the side, and I feel a great affinity with pragmatism. I feel, at least, because of my Bourdieuian habitus, if you like, and I feel there is a lot of affinity between the two. Nevertheless, I have to say that I am not a scholar of religion. I am engaging in studies of certain religious experiences, insofar as they are social experiences among Lebanese Christians and Lebanese Muslims. And so when someone asked me, how do you feel about giving the lecture today, I said, well, I feel a bit ambivalent about whether I should be giving a lecture on religious experience, given that, and someone said to me, well, you make it quite clear. This is not a religious experience. And I said, yeah, well, I hope people will take it literally, and those who don't want to take it literally can take it as a kind of arty Magritte thing that I'm trying to do. This is not a religious experience, juxtaposed to whatever I'm going to be talking about. I hope, nevertheless, that what I'm talking about, which is mainly about the logic of extermination, will have some validity in making people think about aspects, pragmatic aspects of experience as James has analyzed them. And I hope that this is not just paying kind of like polite lip service, so to speak. Just like to say, to begin with, a bit autobiographically, that I left Lebanon when I was 19 to go to Australia, and I witnessed a bit of the Lebanese civil war between Christians and Muslims as it was experienced by us at the time. And being born in a very staunchly Christian background, I have to say that I left Lebanon as an anti-Muslim racist. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say this, and that it was in the West, so to speak, although in the rarefied milieus of the university, among liberal friends, that it was nevertheless in the West that my anti-Muslim racism was undone. And so towards the mid-1980s, late 80s, especially after the Iranian Revolution, I was struck by a slightly strange experience when I started encountering the very same discourses, positions about Muslims that I had ditched when I left Lebanon. And it became for me a kind of like re-immersion in the very thing I left, and a kind of like not so pleasant sense of familiarity. Sometimes I even would have a kind of like competitive view when I hear some racist comment about Muslims. Say, you think you're overdoing it, you should hear what we Lebanese Christians used to say during the war, or this kind of thing. And now, sort of like in the last couple of years, I'm working ethnographically with Muslim Lebanese immigrants in France, England, US, and Australia. And I've become much more focused on their experience and in the world, across the world. And of course, I have seen the 9/11 change and what it has done among them. And I've seen the books that are coming out about how intolerant Islam is. I've read them. I've sort of like been looking at all the Gallup polls, which say that 50% of Americans wouldn't mind if Muslims are marked in some specific way or another. I have seen sort of like other wonderful sort of like, I think a kind of radio show. I'll read that bit which came out, I took from the web. So when radio host Jerry Klein suggested that all Muslims in the United States should be identified with a crescent-shaped tattoo or a distinctive armband, the phone lines jammed instantly. The first caller to the station in Washington said that Klein must be off his rocker, but the second congratulated him and added, not only do you tattoo them in the middle of their forehead, but you ship them out of this country. They're all here to kill us. And then the show became full of litanies along this line of, yes, yes, Markham. And Klein had to come out in the end of the show and say, look, it was a joke. It was a host. I was just checking your reaction, and I'm surprised how many people were actually agreeing to this. Then in Australia, of course, I have seen what is nothing short of a pogrom, in which there were the visual sights on television of literally thousands of young beach, easygoing Aussies getting stuck and circling one single Lebanese Muslim. I have seen also radio commentators saying that this is not serious because these young people were just making a point. So I'm faced with all this data, and slowly it started filtering to me that there was an element that was not so nice about it. And it came to me when I was reading Balibar that there might be some relation between the totalities of these experiences and what Balibar is talking about. What is strikingly similar in Arendt and Foucault is the fact that neither of them believes that processes of mass extermination or more generally elimination ever were possible in history, especially in modern history, without their victims being, so to speak, prepared for elimination, i.e. progressively and institutionally marked as potential future victims and collectively pushed into a social symbolic corner. Both Foucault and Arendt agree this preparation for elimination happened with the category of race. Both write in their own manner long genealogies ending with singular events, but insist on the fact that a preparation is not an acting out, an actual process of elimination or mass elimination. Without preparation, you cannot have elimination, but with the preparation, you still don't have the elimination itself, only its condition of possibility. In this presentation, I am calling this preparatory state described above, where the other is considered as exterminable but is not yet subjected and will not necessarily be subjected to extermination. I'm calling it a state of exterminability. I will also use variations such as culture of exterminability, or in a slightly different sense, specters of extermination. The latter is to denote the fact that we are talking about a state where extermination does not exist as a fully fledged social phenomena. Rather, it exists as a tendency or a hovering possibility, but as such exists as a socio-cultural reality to leave its effect on our daily lives. I will be arguing that we in the Western world gradually, but particularly since the turn of this century, have seen a slow undermining of the liberal, relaxed and multicultural forms of nationalism which have been the hallmark of the 70s and 80s, and are witnessing a reaffirmation of anxious, aggressive, white European forms of nationalism that carry within them the seeds of this culture of exterminability. Globally, and though it takes different forms in different national settings, the exterminable other of this new nationalism is an imaginary group, increasingly delineated with the usage of the signifier Muslim. Being imaginary does not mean non-empirical. It means empirical but imagined in a specific way. As such, the group behind this signifier encompasses both more and less than what a dictionary definition of Muslim will yield. It is located in a space that is a meeting ground between a number of explicit or implicit others belonging to the long history of Western colonialism in the Islamic world. Arab, Muslim, Middle Easterner, more recently, in a derogatory sense, sand nigger, but more implicitly and subliminally, my favorite term is third world looking, which I think is a category which is often meant but never said. Look at people say, you're third world looking. You can't define what third world looking, but we know what it means in imagination, third world looking, and what kind of imaginary it accompanies. I will deal with the haziness and perhaps also the laziness of this classification later. Suffice to say here that though we know very well that Muslim does not correspond empirically with any phenotype, this has not stopped the Western collective imagination from creating and imposing an imaginary Muslim that we are all complicit in creating, sometimes the Muslims among us included. That is, regardless of how many Muslims who do not fit the imaginary stereotype we have come to know when we read or hear the words a Muslim man or a Muslim woman, a third world looking person will pop in front of us. Now, I want to use, I've moved this far here also. I want to use this to argue then that there is a culture of exterminability. But the main issue I want to deal with today is more associated with towards the middle, where we have something like Balaba is saying that the exterminable look are driven towards social symbolic corner, where they acquire the status of living corpses or masses of individuals who are neither completely alive nor yet already dead. And it is this classification of the exterminable as living corpse which I want to work with a bit, because I find that it is starting to belong to a very strong intellectual tradition, a tradition which is increasingly dominating itself, a tradition articulated to philosophical work like Giorgio Agamben, Homo Sapiens, but also way back to Foucault's biopolitics, from which Agamben has started working, but also, for some of you who might know, Membe's work on necropolitics, and most recently, my anthropological colleague, Appadurai, in the book The Fear of Small Numbers, also deploys a very similar mode of thinking about the extreme other, if you like, the exterminable other in Western societies, using Mary Douglas' classification of dirt as that which is in between, matter out of place, etc. I find that in all this tradition there is a certain passivity which is imputed to those who are supposed to be exterminable. There are certain political and intellectual problems with this passivity, because politically it kind of like implies that what is awful about extermination is that these people are sitting there like living corpses, innocent, and that if someone does something nasty, maybe it's okay to exterminate them. And so this allows us to think that it's not okay to exterminate people, even if they are objectively nasty. So extermination is not something one should think a human being with. Intellectually, there is also, it seems to me, a problem with this tradition of conceiving extermination, because it takes the Holocaust and the concentration camp as its paradigm, and it is not clear to me whether the concentration camp is the space where the other is prepared for extermination, or is it the space where extermination begins? So there is a temporal problem in taking the extermination camp as the paradigm of the exterminable, because to me it seems the extermination camp is already way into the process of extermination. But also it gives a certain sense that those who engage in extermination, or those who start thinking exterminability, are by necessity monsters from within. That is, they classify people and say, look at them, they are helpless little things, but I'm going to kill them anyway. Well, it seems a bit unrealistic. The least we could do is try and face the fact that if someone exterminates others, or if someone classifies others as exterminable, they must think of them as some kind of a threat. They must think of them as something that is about to harm them in some way or another. And I think these are the things I want to recover in a conception of exterminability. But ultimately, I also want to see what will happen to our humanity, and probably the most relevant part of my talk, what happens to what is sacred in an intellectual sense about our humanity when we are contemplating and classifying people as exterminable. So the overall then aim of my research, though, has been looking at a historical, sociological, and political argument concerning the transformation of Western nationalism and the rise and the specificity of the Muslim other within this transformed nationalism. When I look at France, England, the US, obviously we are witnessing a globalization of the Muslim other. But at the same time, this globalization is similar, follows a similar trend to what Ulf Hannetz argues, which is that every homogenization is also a heterogenization. That is, the Muslim other takes different forms in different national spaces. But as part also of the work I'm doing is an analytical, theoretical, and anthropological argument about the usefulness of a conception of social life, whether individual, social, national, or even cosmological, as a process of domestication. And I want to spend a little bit of time working on this notion of domestication to show how it links up with extermination. Keith Thomas, in Man and the Natural World, remarks that domestication of nature is the archetypal pattern of other kinds of social subordination. I take this remark as my starting point, but I consider domestication a lot more than a practice of subordinating nature. I consider it, above all, a theory of being, insofar as being is a mode of spatial inhabitance and belonging. Let me be clear that I'm not arguing that the way people inhabit and belong to the nation is like the process of domesticating nature. Rather, I am saying that if there is a similarity between the way we classify otherness within the nation and the way we classify it in the natural world, this is because both are instances of the way we humans inhabit social and symbolic space in general. Whether it is the nation, the farm, our houses, or the cosmos, we inhabit those spaces as domesticators. And this is why what attracts me mostly about domestication. That before I go into this, let me say that I consider domestication as an addition to Bourdieu's argument about what he calls the accumulation of being. That sociology, anthropology aims above all to capture how humans accumulate being. For Bourdieu, the starting point of any social analysis which aspires to capture what Marcel Mauss calls the point of view of the total human is the idea that social life is a political economy of being, a process through which being, in the general sense of a satisfactory, meaningful life, is something that is socially produced, distributed, and accumulated. I've always told people that Bourdieu is the anti-Shakespearean par excellence, because he always says, to be or not to be is not the question, because being is not an either-or question. Being is a more or less. People have more being or less being, not restrained to either. And the whole of life is precisely about this distribution of being. Now, all of Bourdieu's theoretical apparatus can be seen as the development of the means of capturing this political economy of being. People mistakenly think of Bourdieu's notion of cultural capital and capital accumulation as if they are borrowed from marginal economics. For Bourdieu, capital is above all that which pursuit gives our life a meaning. Whatever I pursue which gives my life a meaning is capital. To accumulate cultural capital is therefore literally to accumulate specific things that give our life a buzz. To be an academic, you accumulate academic capital; a novelist, you accumulate literary capital, etc. Habitus is also about the accumulation of being, but it is so through the accumulation of a practical capacity to deploy oneself in the world. This is moving much too fast. Now, what I want to add in domestication is to see being as the accumulation of homeliness. But what attracts me about domestication is that homeliness is not just perceived as a cozy thing. Homeliness involves both domus and dominus. This is from Émile Benveniste's analysis of the etymology of domestication. To domesticate is to seek both a sense of homeliness and a sense of domination. One is not done at the expense of the other. We do both. Both are produced in the very same practice of domestication. Domestication allows us to capture the spatial dual form of belonging. This is first the spatial dual form. When I say this is my space, when I say this is my farm, or this is my university, or this is my nation, it always involves what appears at the level of the imagination two contradictory modes of imagining spatially the self. Because I am saying, for instance, this is my nation, I say, I belong to the nation. And when I say I belong to the nation, in the imagination, I am imagining myself as a point and the nation is a container. I am in the nation. But also, when I say this is my nation, I am imagining the opposite, which is the nation belongs to me. I belong to the nation, I am contained by the nation, but the nation belongs to me, I am the container, and the nation is that which I am enveloping. Container, home-seeking, power-seeking, determined agency, all of these seem to me to be articulated within the concept of domestication. So what attracts me in this concept is that it moves the way between the two and allows us to think that we are doing all of these things at the very same time in our practice of existing in social space. Now I come to how does domestication allow us to think of classification and how this can allow us to think of exterminability. When you look at all the works done in the domain of domestication, one of the most important things, like when you look at classics like the work of Buffon, for instance, the issue of a very instrumental issue of usage and utility emerged to begin with, and the second one is about harm and danger. This appears initially as very simple. We classify things as along an axis of harm and an axis of usage. Now, it's very important here to realize that this is not either things are harmful or harmless, either useful or useful. To domesticate is to take otherness and start working with it to make it harmless, useful. If you can, shape it. This is number one. This is subjective. That is, it is from the subjectivity of the domesticator and the sense of power. There's nothing which is either useful in itself or harmful in itself. It is dependent on the domesticator. Very importantly, it depends on also where the domesticated is positioned within the practice of domestication. Now, just to give you an idea, these things, why are they important in thinking racism? When I say I am sitting watching the lawn in my house, green, beautiful lawn, and a rabbit pops on the lawn. I say, cute. Now, to me, cute means I have classified the rabbit as harmless and useful. Useful in the sense aesthetically pleasing. It gives me a little warm, little bun. Okay, I lock it, classify it as harmless. Then a second rabbit comes on my lawn. I look, two cute rabbits are on my lawn. I say, wow. Then a third rabbit comes on my lawn. Now, what I'm basically saying, I have started from a position as a domesticator where function of the number, I had classified the rabbit as harmless, useful, something I want to exclude and exploit aesthetically. And suddenly, as the numbers of the rabbits increase, I see the exterminator in me rising very slowly but surely, and the classification becomes entirely different. So, now, it depends on my capacity, of course, whether I have a big garden, small garden, whether I like lots of rabbits, little rabbits. It depends on many things, but there is no doubt that there is a threshold in classification in which the change. Now, you might think, well, what's that got to do with anything? But I am basically telling you that when someone I'm doing interviewing tells me, I like Vietnamese people. We had a wonderful Vietnamese family in my street, but now there's too many. Now, this is the logic. This is exactly the logic. One rabbit is cute. Thank you. So, it brings us face to face with something very important in domestication, and that is, what do we exterminate? Because, especially in theories of racism, often there is an association between inferiorization and extermination. And that's, to begin with, I find this slightly strange, because we human beings do not exterminate what we consider as inferior. We can walk around life in the streets and think of many things as inferior. And we don't immediately develop a desire to exterminate them just because, some people think, I've seen on campus that people are really political and they think that others who think differently from them are intellectually inferior. That doesn't mean they want to run around and exterminate them, I don't think, anyway. But what is important is that extermination comes when we classify things as a threat, not when we classify things as inferior. It is when we start classifying things as a threat that the notion of extermination emerges. So to understand why we classify extermination, we have to start thinking about the notion of a threat and what is something threatening. What is it that we exterminate? Notice we exterminate, if you take innocently certain things that we exterminate on a daily basis, like our concept of weed or cockroaches. And let's take the weed as something we exterminate. This is. Can't we have this stop doing this? Why does it keep moving by itself? Shall I keep it like this? Sorry.
Is it moving?
Yeah, but it seems to be changing by itself. No, it's okay. It's okay. Okay, so when you take the weed as something exterminable, what is a weed? Why do we think weeds are harmful and useless and we want to exterminate them? We think of them as harmful and useless when I want to exterminate this. We think of them as harmful and useless.
Could we use this? Could we project this? Because
Yes, I was going to keep it. We'll try. So, what I am saying about the weed is basically that it is a counter-domesticating order. Why? The weed is domesticating my garden for its own purposes. There's nothing bad about the weed. The weed, all it's doing is saying, I want to suck nutrition from the land for me. And I say to the weed, no, I want nutrition in this garden to come to my beautiful roses, etc. You are bad because I can't use you for my purposes. We exterminate counter-domesticating orders. We want our own domesticating order to prevail. So, I'm trying to cut here because I noticed something. Now, what I want to say is, first of all, this is not just about gardening or about some kind of using metaphors for gardening to explain social phenomena. What I'm saying is that there is a mode in which we exist as gardeners, as farmers. The way we exist in the world makes us think this way. So, I want to show you this beautiful quote by Hage here. Now, what interests me about that quote is that Zionists are people who had to think the nation from scratch, so to speak. And what I like about that piece of work by Hage is that he is thinking a Jewish nation without knowing where the Jewish nation is going to be. In that text, famously, he asks, Palestine or Argentina? So he does not have the nationalist thought is the children of European nationalism, but without a specific space in which he is thinking the nation. So it gives us, in a sense, because of that nature, it gives us a nationalism which is neither theoretical, it's the practical nationalism, but at the same time it is just the logic of nationalism without a nation. So it's sort of like, if you wish to find, we shall not find a state today, we shall not do it in the way which would have been done. Supposing, for example, we were obliged to clear a country of wild beasts, we should not set about the business in the fashion of Europeans in the 15th century. We should not take spear lands and go about singly in pursuit of bears. We should organize a large and active hunting party, drive the animals together, and throw a melanite bomb in them. Now, what is Hage doing? Now, retrospectively, some people might like to think that sort of like murderous things. We can see what was going to happen to the Palestinians just by reading this book. But what I'm trying to say is that this is no different from any other nationalism. This is the basis of nationalism that we are seeing here. No different. And that what is nationalism? Nationalism is the domestication of national space. And when you are domesticating national space, you immediately think as a domesticator. Why? Not because you want to dominate, because you want to dominate and because you want to feel at home in your nation. Both. Because both are part of the process of how you establish yourself in that space. As a matter of fact, in the text, Hage moves immediately after the beast to start talking about what he called home building. So home building is predicated on the extermination of beasts, etc. So, of course, the usage of the wolf here, metaphorically, is precisely that will which is not amenable to be used in my national garden. Now, I'd like this brings us face to face with something very important. In theory, we talk a lot about the other. In theory, it's sort of like we are saturated with the other. In modes of racism, in combating racism, we talk about how we are supposed to handle the other, how we are supposed to be nice to the other. We are multicultural, we appreciate other as difference. Now, it seems to me that the issue facing us in understanding both those others we do not like and how to be nice with the other is the will of the other. It's not the other, because we can live with others. It is the will of the other when it is a representative of a counter-domesticating order that we cannot live with. The other as cultural difference. Sure, it's hard to cope with cultural difference. Now, when you start saying that we exterminate others because they are matter out of space, it's starting to look like I exterminate others because I have a conceptual problem with them. Now, I mean, yeah, sure, we have conceptual problems with others if they are in between, etc., but to want to eradicate them because they are in between is a bit much, it seems to me. So eradicate people who are a threat. It's very interesting today because part of that theory that people are working with, Foucault, Agamben, etc., uses a lot of the work of Carl Schmitt on the state of exception. Now, what is interesting about Carl Schmitt is that he provides us with the best conception of the enemy. And for him, what he gives us a description of is precisely why the Nazis not saw the Jew as cultural difference or as matter out of place, but as an existential threat. And the notion of existential threat for Schmitt represented precisely that which is trying to implement an order which undermines my order. This is why one gets the shiver today when Israelis keep talking about existential threats, existential threat, existential threat, and the notion of the Palestinian as the existential threat. We see that these notions are not about difference, cultural difference, how to cope, but about who is at home in the world and whose order is going to be implemented. Nevertheless, in the history of race, where are we as far as time is concerned? 15. Now, from this position, I try to show that what we have is another of the body and another of the will. The other of the body is what I try to domesticate. The other of the will is that which escapes my domestication, and I have to deal. Now, in the history of racism, we have the same process. We can see how in the history of European colonialism, we have the other of the body, the black African of colonial racist imagination. This is the domesticated one, the other who I can use to actually do work, what have you. But the anti-Semitic other is the one that represents another order. The anti-Semitic other is the other of extermination. I'm not interested in getting them to work that much. I just exterminate them, while the African other is the other of exploitation. Now, this does not mean, and this is where it gets rather intellectually interesting for me, but a bit dreary, is that this does not mean, of course, that in the history of racism, African others were not eliminated. Of course, they were eliminated. The indigenous people in Australia were eliminated the native Indians here were eliminated. But there is something qualitatively different about this elimination from the elimination which is part of the mode we see anti-Semitism. Why? Again, because we get to a logic of number. The other of the body is eliminated until it is contained. So I can keep eliminating, but comes a point where I say, okay, I've killed enough from them, of them, and they're manageable. They are manageable. I have exterminated a lot, but okay, I can stop here. This is what I call in one of my writings colonial necrophilia, because colonialism has a history of enjoying others after they have assassinated them socially. You get rid of the indigenous people, and once you've got them socially eradicated, you start enjoying their arts, you start loving the way they dance, you even enjoy their resistance and marvel at their resistance, but all from the position of the person who has already done the extermination and made that other manageable. Now, what is interesting about the exterminated other is that the exterminated other is never an object of social necrophilia. The exterminated other, you never kill enough from them. One is a danger. I don't sit, the Nazi will not say, okay, now that we have killed enough Jews, let's enjoy Jewish art and Jewish intellect. I say, there's still some of them. I want to eradicate them. Now, what is this difference between the two logics? This is where we get, it seems to me, this is where we get to the devil. This is because the other can represent not just a difficult object to domesticate, but starts representing the embodiment of the counter-domesticating order. One is enough because one is still representing that which is going to be undermining all my being. And this one is enough to undermine all my being because this one is not just body, it is the emanation of a counter-domesticating order. And the counter-domesticating order is, of course, present in the devil. So, if you like, we want an alterology, a mode of thinking otherness and colonial otherness, which differentiates between the other as animal and the other as devil. Where does the other tip from being animal to being pure devil? Of course, because the two coexist in the history, and one takes over from the other in the process of classification. Those who are truly to be exterminated to the last are the representatives of this totally other order, which ultimately represent the devil. Now, what interests me is that the Arab-Muslim colonial other has always had a very ambivalent position in this modality of thinking otherness, because the Arab-Muslim other historically was neither really a black African nor a Jew. It was never sort of like perceived in the history of racism as, yes, they're good bodies to exploit things with, but never perceived as, well, they're devilish. There are always fluctuation between the two. Even phenotypically, an imaginary phenotype of the Muslim Arab, you get a sense that what are they? They're not black Africans, and they're not Jews. They're in between somewhere in this shady area. Even Muslim religion is perceived as not really African, since it is monotheist, but at the same time, look at the way they imagine paradise. No, that's a bit shady. That makes them towards sort of like the otherness of the other. So this modality of seeing the Arab other, the Muslim other, and again, it's hazy here. What are we talking about? Arab, Muslim, etc. Now, what I'd like to argue is that what we are witnessing today is a shift in the conception of the Muslim other as increasingly a counter-domesticating will. That is, the other is increasingly, the Arab other, the Muslim other, is perceived not just as cultural otherness, not just as a problem of domestication, but as something representing a devilish thing that is going to undermine my order. And this, as a theory of domestication shows us, is very much intimately linked to changes. First, the institutionalization of a political Islam in the era of Khomeini. We see increasingly a shift in the way the Muslim is perceived. Very important, the Salman Rushdie affair, because the Salman Rushdie affair created a sense whereby people are saying, not only is there a Muslim political will, but in my garden, in the Western world, there's this guy representing another will who is willing to act in the name of that will in my domestic space. Not only this, even people who were supposedly in my domestic space and under my law are suddenly acting in the name of the law of the other, the ordinary. This is where we can see a shift here. For instance, in the significance and meaning of a scarf. We cannot capture it ethnographically, this meaning, without all this. This is what I'm trying to say. That is, a scarf is not a scarf. A scarf is not just an object of cultural difference. It can be an object of cultural difference, but suddenly, when you look at a scarf and you say, this is the law of the other in my space, because when we talk about the law of the other, we are talking about often the patriarchal law of the other. We are saying, look, I cannot domesticate women in my space. This is in the male order. I say, look, in my garden, in my nation, my patriarchy rules. And here we have a situation where it is the patriarchy of the other that is ruling in my domestication space. So this is then why it becomes threatening, not just threatening to the intellect, but threatening as an existential threat. I cannot rule in my domestic space. Also, there's something very interesting about transnational Islam, which I call transnational Bilalism. And Bilal, of course, is the slave who followed Muhammad in early history. Now, there's something which is quite subversive about this Bilalism, in the sense that you find a certain affinity between Islamic religion as it is existing today and the underclass. In Australia, last year, there was a riot in one of the jails because there were interethnic conflict, and the director of the jail decided to segregate people in the jail according to their ethnicity. So he put everyone in one, and suddenly there were riots in the among indigenous Australians, and without anyone knowing why initially. And it turned out that what indigenous Australians were writing about was that they wanted to stay with the Lebanese Muslims because they were getting lessons in the Quran and in Islam, and they were enjoying it, and they were being deprived of this. Now, there is a certain affinity. I'm not sure what it is, but it is interesting and has to be taken into account. An affinity between the structure of thinking of Islam today and the underclass. Finally, I want, as I said in Domestication, domestication is not just about the conception of the other and is not about simply the changes to the other. Domestication is about also the sense of power of the domesticator. And there are changes that are happening in the Western world today which are independent of the transformation of Muslims in it, which are making the Western domesticator, so to speak, more fragile. First, there's a sense of being besieged. I mean, I think it is interesting from a cultural point of view. Hannah Arendt used to talk about civil war as a metaphor for understanding international relations. I think today the colonial settler colony is much more a good way of understanding international relations. I think we feel in many Western societies that the whole globe is being transformed into one big colonial settler colony, where everyone in the West is feeling surrounded by barbarians. The barbarians, which is the ethos of the colonial settler society. The barbarians are out to get us. Sometimes the barbarians are barbarians I can use for labor and barbarians who are a threat. Sometimes these two coincide. So Muslim Algerians are an existential threat, but also laborers. Sometimes there's a separation, like in the United States. The laborers are Mexican, but the existential threat is Muslim. So one has to look at how this sense of being besieged by different kind of others works in specific social situations. There's increasingly, and that's very much colonial settler culture, a phallic modality of identification with the national values. I'll give you quickly an example because I've run out of time. How do you experience democracy phallically as opposed to experience democracy? I can put it very clear. Simply, phallic democracy is the democracy you have rather than the democracy you live. It's when your culture becomes more interested in saying, I have democracy, or my democracy is better than your democracy. Look at my democracy. The language of democracy becomes not the language of living, and you're not interested. In fact, sometimes you do this at the expense of living your democracy, but what's important is to flash your democracy. That's why we call it phallic democracy, because you're interested in showing it off and engaging in competitive democracy. This is very much part of colonial settler ethos. I just finished very quickly by also talking about cultures of stuckedness. It's very interesting when you think how being stuck or feeling stuck, not feeling stuck in life, becomes a dominant metaphor in our everyday life in the West. Before, our sense of heroism used to be the climber of Annapurna. Today, It is the person who gets stuck in a disaster and survives being stuck. We have increasingly situations where there's, earthquake, there's disaster, someone gets stuck in a building, and then we celebrate. We found him after 3 days, and someone sort of like say, he got stuck for 6 days. She was under the rubble for 10 days and is still alive. There's the heroism of the stuck. It's about how much can you live being stuck. And now this mode of stuckedness, this culture of stuckedness, is a reflection of a whole political economy of being stuck in your job, being stuck existentially, being stuck. It is a reflection of how the political economy of Western society is shifting, how our relation to jobs shifting. All of these lead to a making fragile the Western sense of power and making the other looks even more threatening than it is. So I'll finish with this. I hope that my words were not too threatening for your domesticated thought garden, and that when they came towards your little domestic theories, you did not think they ought to be exterminated. Often understanding means that you have been able to domesticate my thought. We like to think that understanding means I took your thought as they are and I got them. But understanding really means that I can take your thought, play with it, make it harmless, useful for me, and position it in my garden. And it seems to me, in a very interesting way, that this is what William James meant by pragmatism. And I hope I lived at least a bit with his spirit in this presentation. Thank you. As some people might know, I am hearing impaired. So if people want to ask questions, I will move forward and be close to them to be able to hear them. Please don't think I'm trying to threaten you or make you feel unwelcome.
But we're going to have to keep it to 10 minutes, but for those of you who feel that there's not enough time for questioning, I remind you that on Friday we can convene in the Center for the Study of World Religion and continue the conversation then and interrogate Ghassan at that point. But any questions right now? Here's one. Sorry.
Framework of the collective discourse today of Muslims across Western Europe and Australia. It's about the narrative, I think. This research has been about the narrative that Muslims have to deal with in different national contexts. And then my question is more on how are you looking at the living costs? What do they do? How do they interact with this discourse of extermination, counter-domestication, that I can see in politicians, intellectuals, journalists, media sphere?
So about how the Muslims themselves, as they are positioned. Well, I mean, the first thing from a perspective of domestication is that there is no outside domestication. That is, it is important not to think of domestication as something nasty, but as something, this is what we do in life. And so, to me, what this allows me to do is get rid of a sense of making people who are victims of the nastier side of domestication become saints immediately. I have no desire to make suddenly Muslims appear fantastic because they are subjected to racism. Or, I mean, history is full of people who are subjected to nasty domestication, which are nasty domesticators themselves for whatever specific reason. So I think that when you look at the wide configuration made out by Muslims, even wide when it is in specific countries, you find all kinds of what you might call domestication mineure, which are minor modes of domestication which aim to exist within larger domestication. But this minor domestication sometimes is based on things which are, to me, as a cosmopolitan intellectual, which is my subjectivity, things which are insufferable. I mean, when I'm doing work ethnographically among Lebanese Muslims, sometimes I genuinely feel like I want to take someone and just wreck their neck. I feel the exterminator in me coming out myself. I mean, like it's not nothing that says to me, look, poor things, this is what's happening to them. So it's very contradictory from an ethical point of view, if you like, to see how Muslims themselves are working out their position. Some are working out by trying to create a better domesticated spaces. Some are actually engaging in transnational domestication. I mean, even you can think of Al-Qaeda as a mode of domestication. I mean, I think the figure of Osama bin Laden is very interesting like this, because it's a continuation of this fluctuation in colonial thinking between, is it black African or is it Jew? Because Osama bin Laden sits very ambivalently and neatly in Western imagination between the migrant worker and the international financier, which is again representative of the other of work and the Jewish other of high finance in anti-Semitic imagination.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, I have to come all the way. Try to speak up a bit, yeah.
I can speak up. As you know, the United States is a very diverse country with a broad range of people, including Muslims, who live here and contribute to the culture. And I wonder if you can help us understand how you're using the term the West, and how the kinds of ideas you're talking about affect people in the West.
Well,
and also
no, sure.
How this kind of presentation relates to the methods you use as an ethnographer, where you're looking.
Well, I mean, I don't think that the United States is unique in being diverse. Even my own family is diverse. It's just a question of at what level of generality you want to operate. I think if you are trying to look at specific spaces, the West might not be a very good category because it does not say much. If you're trying to speak in a very general sense, like I was, it means something. I would be surprised if the West does not mean anything to you in relation to others. But if you're saying, well, the West is not homogeneous, yeah, of course it's not homogeneous, but no other category. But that's not unique to the category the West. It's every single category. I can take it and rip it apart and show that there's billions of ways in which it exists. So to me, It is how you are conceiving the space in which you are operating. So if you are conceiving global space as you are thinking, the West can make sense. If you are perceiving American space, I mean, the West is meaningless because there's many differences between European and American modes of thinking the nation. I've done field work in Boston, New Bedford area, and I've done field work with David Duke in Louisiana. And yes, I know it's diverse, and that they have modes of thinking the nation and modes of thinking which are very completely different, the people are so. But when I'm thinking of the space in which they operate, I can appreciate the difference. When I'm thinking broadly, I can see certain similarities which allow using wide categories.
Perhaps one more question. Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. I enjoyed very much your story of Islam as an American Muslim. I feel sometimes that one would prefer to either exterminate or in any way domesticate, as I came from Catholic, Irish Catholic persuasion here in the Boston area. I'm considered to be very unusual, to say the least. And I'm happy to have you all here on appreciating my domesticity, and thank you specifically as a Lebanese Christian for being so open-minded and so fair in the presentation, because I didn't find anything that I disagreed with, please say. And actually, I was just wondering about the title. Did you mean the Specter of extermination of Western civilization by Muslims, or perhaps we ought to feel that there's a Specter of extermination of us? Because I feel that you interpret it way through.
Well, I mean, what I meant is definitely that what is happening on the ground allows me to sniff the possibility of Muslims being exterminated in the West.
Charles, that won't happen. Tell me about it over the line.
Well, I'm going to draw proceedings to a close by thanking Ghassan for a provocative talk in which he's kind of shared with us what I think for many is a very, very unusual, original way of understanding the kind of pluralist world in which we live. I'm not sure as you are, Ghassan, that William James would have kind of sort of wanted to take it on board, everything you've said, but I think it's been a wonderful sort of evening, and thank you very much.